T'es juif?
Non.
Ich bin Zid?
Non.
Ne réponds jamais quand on parle yiddish.
By the dinner table, Joseph, who had just come home from school, completely broke down. His father sternly ordered him that from this moment on, he must completely forget that he is Jewish. The slap that landed on his son's face cut like a knife through the father's own heart. But he had to make sure his son remembered this rule forever, because no matter what, taking a few slaps was far better than losing one's life. This is a true story of a French Jewish family during World War II. In June 1940, France and Germany signed an agreement, officially recognizing and accepting German rule. From that moment on, all of France was divided into an occupied zone and a free zone. Joseph's family of 6 lived in the occupied zone, and his father was a barber. Relying on his superb skills, he ran a barbershop together with his eldest and second son. As for Joseph and his little brother, their days were filled with school and play, and they especially loved playing marbles, so the family managed to live a flavorful and harmonious life. However, as the German Nazis introduced anti-Jewish laws, the situation for all Jewish people rapidly worsened. The law required that all Jews must wear a clearly visible Star of David. Joseph's family was no exception. It was not until this day, when the father saw the injuries on the faces of Joseph and his little brother after school, that he realized it was time for the whole family to leave this place. That very night, with a grave expression, he spoke to the boys about the misfortune their Jewish people had suffered since their grandfather's generation.
Et il m'a dit qu'il fallait que je parte, seul, pour sauver ma vie. Et c'est ce que j'ai fait. Et aujourd'hui...
C'est notre tour.
Ouais,
Et quand ça?
ce soir.
After that, the father unfolded the escape route map he had planned long ago, but for safety reasons, they were not allowed to write anything down, and everything had to be firmly memorized. Then the whole family began to act separately. Joseph and his little brother had to flee Paris overnight and later reunite with the family in Nice, thousands of miles away. However, this sudden upheaval left Joseph's heart filled with grievance. A child at the age of playing marbles simply could not understand how a once happy family had suddenly been forced to scatter in all directions. Even though his heart was filled with endless reluctance, Joseph still stepped out of the house under the cover of night. At this moment, watching the backs of their children through the window, the parents felt their hearts being cut by knives. Under the night sky, the train roared across the fields, and Joseph spent his first night without his parents by his side on that train. And from that moment on, their road of escape truly began. What none of them could have imagined was that this escape would last nearly 3 years of constant displacement. Soon, the tense and exhausted Joseph fell asleep while fiddling with his beloved marble, but not long after, he was startled awake by a burst of noisy commotion. It turned out the train had only stopped temporarily midway, but it alarmed many refugees hiding on board. They jumped off the train to flee for their lives, yet all of them were chased down by German soldiers. Everything before Joseph's eyes threw him into panic. Facing the increasingly close inspections by the Germans, they had nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. Just as the 2 brothers were about to be taken away by the Germans, a priest suddenly signaled for them to come over.
T'as pas de papier, monsieur le curé?
Si vous avez l'air d'avoir peur, ils vont s'en apercevoir, alors souriez. Oui, j'ai beaucoup maigri, mais c'est bien moi. Les enfants sont avec moi.
Bon, merci.
In this way, with the help of this kind priest, they narrowly passed the German inspection. When they thanked the priest for his kind lie, he comforted them with deep compassion. After that, they set off once again and boarded a bus heading for the next destination. However, when they arrived at the agreed meeting place, things did not go according to the original plan. The guide who was supposed to escort them never showed up. At the same time, more and more people were stranded there, and the escape plan was clearly becoming impossible to carry out as intended. The 2 brothers once again faced the risk of being discovered by the Germans. Fortunately, at that very moment, a local man said he was willing to provide them with a guide-like service. Although he would charge a certain fee, the money was not much, but the older brother was full of doubts. However, kind-hearted Joseph decisively accepted the offer. Although his father's warnings were still ringing in his ears, Joseph chose to trust at this moment. In the end, they agreed to set off at night. After confirming the route, the 2 brothers were finally able to catch their breath for a short while. Although they had been constantly on the move, the oppressive feeling from their life in Paris was gone, and at this moment they felt both physical and mental freedom. In this way, although there had been a small mishap while waiting for the guide, Everything worked out in the end and Joseph was not disappointed. Led by this trustworthy guide, they were fortunate enough to avoid German checkpoints and patrols, and finally entered the so-called free zone. In the free zone, although they no longer had to worry about being taken away by the Germans, reaching Nice to reunite with their families still meant facing an even harsher journey, because from this point on, there were almost no means of transportation, and they had to continue on foot. At such a young age, Joseph was forced to challenge the limits of his own body. After more than 20 kilometers of walking, Joseph's feet were covered in blisters. Seeing his stubborn younger brother, the older brother lifted Joseph onto his back.
Tu sais que tu pues des pieds, toi?
Toi, tu pues du cul. Et merci quand même.
C'est normal. T'es mon petit frère. Je te porterai jusqu'au bout du monde s'il le fallait.
In this way, he walked for a while, rested for a while, and kept moving forward under the heavy burden. Just when he was about to give up, a truck miraculously appeared on the road, and the kind driver reached out to help them. After that, Joseph quickly regained his strength, but they did not want to end the journey just yet, because along this long road of escape, aside from physical exhaustion, the brothers had gained an unprecedented sense of freedom in both body and mind, and at times they even forgot they were fleeing. So before arriving in Nice, they secretly changed their original route so they could experience more of everything along the way. A few days later, they finally saw the blue sea, and the entire city of Nice appeared before their eyes. In the end, after crossing mountains and rivers, the whole family reunited in Nice. Tears of joy sparkled in everyone's eyes. They swore they would never be separated again. Soon after, Joseph's family quickly settled into life in Nice. His father and older brothers reopened a barbershop in the market. His older brother even started dating a girlfriend. Joseph, meanwhile, took on a job doing odd tasks. In fact, he was preparing for something important. This also became the most carefree period of Joseph's life since the escape. One day, after work, the father was relaxing with neighbors who were also Jewish, but when the neighbors suddenly spoke in Jewish language, it made him uneasy. However, his cautious attitude was met with ridicule from the neighbors. Everyone believed he was being overly pessimistic. Seeing nothing but darkness, they insisted that being in the free zone meant there was no danger, and that no one would care whether you were Jewish or not. But the father stated that since the war was not yet over, a certain level of vigilance was still necessary. At that moment, an Italian soldier sitting with them, who was there on vacation, suddenly revealed a piece of news that made everyone's hearts tremble. Mussolini had fallen.
Qu'est-ce qu'il y a?
Mussolini a été arrêté. À Rome, c'est le chaos.
Qu'est-ce qui va se passer?
Pour vous, je sais pas, mais pour nous, ça veut dire qu'on rentre en Italie. On part demain. C'est fini les vacances.
At this time, Joseph had no idea what this meant, and he even thought the war might finally be over. However, his father told him that this meant the Germans were about to attack the free zone, and Nice would soon become German territory. In an instant, a dark cloud once again hung over Joseph's heart. However, at this very moment, another joyful event was enough to let Joseph temporarily forget the unease before him. The whole family was preparing to celebrate his mother's birthday, and he also had something important to announce. So on his mother's birthday, a gift box appeared before her. This was a birthday present Joseph had carefully prepared for his mother, and for it he had worked as an errand boy for a full 3 months. When the box was opened, a violin that felt both familiar and unfamiliar appeared before his mother's eyes. At that moment, the entire family felt Joseph's love for his mother. Although she complained that he should not have spent so much money, her face was filled with happiness, because this violin awakened far too many memories for her. Memories of love and memories of family. At that moment, she became the happiest person in the world. Soon, the whole family was immersed in the long-missed sound of her violin. However, this rare moment of warmth was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door. Sensing that something was wrong, the father immediately told everyone to hide, to protect his wife and children. At this moment he had to face it alone. Yet when the door opened, what he received were 2 conscription orders held by the police. The 2 eldest sons were conscripted to serve in Germany, with no conditions and no choice. Just at that moment, the sound of roof tiles slipping from where the children were hiding caused the police to stop and investigate. As the police pressed closer step by step, the wife suddenly appeared and defused the situation by claiming a Russian noble identity.
Vous transmettez les papiers du STO à vos fils, Henri et Albert?
Ce sera fait.
Allez, bonne journée.
Merci. Il faut partir d'ici.
With a sigh from the father, the family had no choice but to face separation once again. But Joseph burst into tears, filled with grievance, feeling that their good days had barely begun before he had to part from his parents again. Yet everything was done simply to stay alive. This time, the father arranged for someone to send the two brothers into a youth military training camp run by the new government. With heavy hearts, the parents gave Joseph a few words of advice.
Allez, faut y aller maintenant. On se voit bientôt. On se voit bientôt.
And after a reluctant farewell, the two brothers remained hidden in the camp. Although it was a government organization, the identities of all the children there existed like a mystery, and not a single one of them was truly Catholic, while everyone silently understood the truth. From the tone of his father's friends, they also learned that many others had gone through experiences just like theirs. They themselves soon received proof of this as well. In the dormitory, a teenage boy noticed Joseph looking through photos of his parents and warned him to hide them carefully. However, after the Germans fully took control of the Free Zone, the new government had become little more than a name, and the living conditions of all Jewish people worsened accordingly. Jews were even being secretly transferred every week, and the entire city of Nice lived in constant fear. By comparison, the youth camp was much more stable. Still, in order to deal with sudden German inspections, Joseph and his brother memorized the complete family background and identity of an African roommate. Just in case, they also became friends with the supply driver. As time passed, Joseph grew increasingly homesick for his parents, yet there was still no news from them. One day, the two brothers secretly hopped onto the driver's truck and slipped out of the camp, wanting to return to the market to check on their parents. Along the way they laughed and talked, completely unaware that this impulsive act would eventually plunge them into a bottomless abyss, because throughout the entire city of Nice, people were being arrested everywhere. In the end, they could not escape their fate, and were captured by German soldiers halfway through the journey. They were then forced onto a military truck, waiting to undergo strict German inspections. For Joseph and his brother, this inspection was a barrier they simply could not cross, because they were Jews who had already been registered. Their eventual fate was easy to imagine. Fortunately, the brothers had at least made some emergency preparations, such as memorizing the identity information of their African roommate. However, when they witnessed the inspection of the driver, Joseph fell into complete despair. In the face of overwhelming evidence, the ordinary supply driver they had known turned out not only to be Jewish, but also admitted to being a member of the Jewish resistance. After shouting with passion that France would be victorious, he was immediately dragged away by the Nazis and executed. Yet the driver's courageous act deeply shook Joseph. But when it came time to inspect his brother, the boy was already so frightened that he burst into tears. Just as the interrogators slapped him across the face, Joseph suddenly erupted in a shout of defiance.
Arrêtez! On est Algérien! Algérien catholique!
On reprend. Est-ce que tu es juif?
Non.
After that, they were taken to the infirmary for further medical examination, believing that they had memorized their roommate's background well enough to handle a medical check. They spoke confidently about their African identity. However, the doctor before them dismissed it with contempt.
Asseyez-vous. Je m'appelle Rosen, vous savez ce que ça veut dire, ça?
Que vous êtes rose?
Non, que je suis juif. C'est pour ça que vous pouvez me le dire à moi. Que vous aussi, vous êtes juif.
Bah vous êtes juif. Mais pas nous.
Nous, on est Algériens. C'est pour ça qu'on a notre zboob qui est coupé. Alors, juif ou pas, vous savez ce que vous avez à faire.
Yes, whether you are Jewish or not, you should know what the right thing to do is. When the doctor heard Joseph say this, he suddenly stopped writing the medical report, looked at Joseph with a calm gaze, and then spoke to the guards.
Chirurgirsch gemacht. Nicht religiös. Allez.
In this way, the two brothers were saved by this Jewish doctor, but the Germans still remained highly suspicious of Joseph's identity. In the end, the interrogator released the older brother, but demanded that within 48 hours he return with their baptism certificates to take Joseph away. Otherwise they would both be put on a deportation train. While Joseph waited for his brother, he unfortunately fell seriously ill and remained unconscious for several days. When he finally woke up, he discovered that the Jewish doctor who had once saved them was now also in the holding cell. It turned out that the doctor's Jewish identity had recently been exposed, and now he was the one about to be sent onto the train. Before being taken away, he gave Joseph the marble that Joseph had been clutching in his hand throughout his coma, his most beloved treasure. At that moment, Joseph silently reflected that this man had once used his medical reports to send countless Jews onto the trains, and now he himself had become one of the passengers. Meanwhile, with the help of the camp director, the older brother managed to submit the baptism certificates to the interrogator within the time limit. However, they were immediately declared fake and torn into pieces. The sly interrogator claimed he could swear on his life that the brothers were Jewish and had been lying all along, including the priest standing before him. The priest, however, stated that escalating the matter to the Pope was clearly not something either side wanted to see. In this way, the two brothers became a problem for the interrogator, unable to be released, yet also unable to be arrested outright. In the end, they were assigned to do odd jobs in the back kitchen, waiting for a suitable opportunity to deal with them. Then one day, Joseph and his brother were ordered to go outside to the vegetable garden to pick produce. In reality, this was a trap set by the interrogator, because escaping from there would have been extremely easy, so the interrogator brought the priest along and watched from afar, waiting for the answer he had long wanted. As long as the brothers pushed open that small door, he would immediately send them onto the next train. In the vegetable garden, Joseph naturally saw the free world just one step away, and he and his brother decided to take the risk. But just as they were about to run, Joseph suddenly noticed the shadow of soldiers outside the small door. Fully realizing the situation, Joseph grabbed his brother and held him back. In this way, the interrogator's scheme failed, while the priest who had secretly been helping them stood drenched in sweat. Fortunately, this allowed him to take the brothers away, and they soon boarded a vehicle back to the camp. What they did not expect was that the camp director had arranged for them to meet their father inside the vehicle. Joseph's eyes filled with tears, overwhelmed with emotion. However, their father told them that their mother and brothers were still safe, but the family would have to continue living a fragmented life. After this meeting, he would also need to find a place to hide. At the moment of parting, their father asked them to stay in the training camp and wait, promising that once the war ended, the whole family would return to Paris. So after returning to the camp, the two brothers relied on each other and waited in silent torment. But one night, a sudden urgent message from their mother delivered heartbreaking news. Their father had been taken away by the Germans, and they had to leave the camp immediately. Just like that, Joseph and his brother once again set out on the road of escape. At the same time, they lost contact with everyone else. After crossing the occupied zone and drifting for 3 months, the brothers finally settled in the town of Rumeli. With sheer determination, Joseph and his brother survived once again. The older brother worked at a restaurant, while Joseph worked at a pro-German bookstore and newsstand, trading hard labor for a place to stay. Because Joseph worked tirelessly, his excellent performance earned the shop owner's favor, who even allowed him not only to stay overnight but also to join the family for important Sunday Mass. However, Joseph could not let go of his resentment toward the owner's son, a militiaman who had taken the lives of Jewish people. Even so, this period became the most stable time Joseph had experienced since the escape. Joseph even developed a secret crush on the shop owner's daughter. At the same time, his brother secretly made contact with the Jewish resistance. As a result, Joseph could only see his brother briefly when delivering newspapers. One day, not long after Joseph had just seen his brother, the sound of militia pounding on the door came from outside. The one who burst in turned out to be the shop owner's son, and after their eyes met, he mercilessly searched Joseph, finding nothing but the marble clenched in his hand. He then sneered and told Joseph to get lost, because in his eyes, Joseph had always been nothing but utterly insignificant. Fortunately, his sister, the girl Joseph secretly loved, became someone Joseph could talk to about anything. One day, Joseph decided to tell her his secret, but at that very moment, gunshots echoed in the distance, signaling the execution of resistance members.
Bonjour. Fire!
Frightened, the two held each other, and Joseph never managed to say the words. As the situation continued to change, more and more pro-German collaborators were attacked. The militias who aided the occupiers were labeled traitors and became targets of public fury. One night, the bookstore was also attacked. In panic, the shop owner's family began preparing to flee. Looking at the girl he loved, her face filled with sorrow, Joseph gently spoke to her.
Je sais ce que ça fait de partir, tu sais. Tout le monde dans ma famille a dû partir à un moment. Mon père a dit, faut pas regarder derrière soi quand on marche. Sinon on se casse la gueule.
A few days later, Joseph began another busy day as usual, but the moment he took the day's newspaper from the mailman, he screamed and ran without hesitation.
Joseph! Qu'est-ce qui lui arrive?
The war is over, France is free, the days of suffering are over. Overwhelmed with excitement, Joseph gave away all the front-page newspapers of the day for free. Soon, the entire town turned into a sea of celebration, and French flags reappeared throughout the streets. Reborn townspeople sang and danced, while others vented their anger on collaborators. At that moment, Joseph reunited with his brother in the jubilant crowd, and they were about to return to Paris to reunite with their family. However, as he watched the punishment of collaborators, Joseph suddenly remembered something and ran toward the bookstore, but he never saw the girl he loved again, and the shop owner's family and the entire store had been destroyed. Enraged crowds hurled fists and spit like a storm at the shop owner and his wife. Suddenly, Joseph jumped onto a table and shouted, "I am Jewish!" Joseph's shout stunned everyone, stunned the shop owner and his wife, and even stunned himself. Throughout his escape, he had shouted that he was not Jewish, but at this very moment, he never would again. Watching the bus disappear into the distance also marked the end of Joseph's youthful love. After returning to Paris, Joseph lingered outside the barbershop and saw his father's familiar silhouette. Yet everything had changed.
Papa!
Maman, je veux rentrer.
Maman, c'est moi!
The family that survived against all odds was reunited, but their father was no longer there. Heartbroken, Joseph watched his beloved marble slip from his hand onto the ground, and with that, the film slowly came to an end.